Do you have any updated numbers for us on the number of possible American dead in this situation or the number of possible American hostages?
Thanks, Lawrence, for having me. I don't have any numbers beyond those that the president and Jake Sullivan used earlier today. 14, at least, Americans who have been killed, and as many as 20 or more who remain missing, some of whom we believe are likely to be held in Gaza as captives. I do believe those numbers are likely to rise, perhaps in both cases, just due to the sheer number of Americans who are in Israel at any given moment, several hundred thousand, upwards of 500,000 at least. And so because of fog of war, we have not been able to gather perfect data. It is something that we are really focused on. And the president has said his highest priority is to see to it that we are doing everything we can to try to address the situation of Americans who are in harm's way.
The fog of war for the United States in Gaza must be especially intense because it's not clear to us out here anyway that you have many contact points and contact possibilities for what's going on there. What can you tell us? The president and Jake Sullivan talked about working relentlessly hour by hour to try to get more information about the hostages, the American hostages being held in Gaza. What can you tell us about how that is being done from the White House, from the administration?
We have a number of areas of focus when it comes to people who may be held hostage in Gaza, one of which is we have set up a conduit, an ability for Americans whose loved ones may be missing to contact the State Department and provide information that might make it easier for us to pass to the Israelis and work with the Israelis to try to help locate them. Second, the president has deployed, as you know, because he talked about it today and Jake Sullivan talked about it as well, a team of experts from across the U.S. government in hostage recovery to work with Israeli counterparts on what is going to be a very difficult task of trying to locate and ultimately, we hope, be able to secure the release of these hostages who are in Gaza. And then the third piece of this is we're going to share every bit of intelligence and other information that we can gather through our intelligence capability with our Israeli counterparts, as we quite often do, given our close intelligence relationship with the government of Israel.
The Secretary of State is going to Israel tomorrow. 2 points about that. What is his mission in Israel? And then secondly, would the Secretary of State be going if the United States had a confirmed ambassador to Israel in service there now?
Well, I'll say a few things. One, the Secretary of State is going to Israel first and foremost as a show of solidarity, very much carrying the message that the president conveyed today, that the United States stands with Israel in this very difficult hour, very difficult moment. We celebrate triumphant occasions and happy occasions together. And this past weekend was a holiday weekend when many Americans were celebrating in Israel. And we also mourn our tragedies together. And Secretary Blinken will be going to do just that. He will also be going to engage with our embassy and with American citizens who are in Israel to make sure that they are getting every bit of assistance they need for those who would like to leave the country, for those who have experienced a traumatic situation. Our embassy's foremost mission is to provide support for Americans who live, travel, or work abroad. He would absolutely be going under any circumstance, whether we had a confirmed ambassador or not. Would we prefer to have a confirmed ambassador? Absolutely. And we'd urge Congress to take action to confirm our ambassador right away. We have, by the way, a very capable charge d'affaires in country who has done an outstanding job in lieu of an ambassador over the course of the past very difficult week.
In the president's phone call with Prime Minister Netanyahu today, did the president come out of that phone call confident about the parameters that will be followed in the way Israel responds to this? So did the president come out with any concern of a possible overreaction by Israel?
I guess what I'd say about that is it's not for the United States to set the parameters of the operation that Israel is already conducting and has said quite clearly that it intends to intensify in the coming days. What the president said is that he and the prime minister had an exchange about the fact that democracies like the United States and Israel are stronger, are more secure when they act in accordance with principles like the rule of law, and that very much goes for the law of war in the conduct of military operations. Beyond that, I'm not going to can't characterize the president's confidence level one way or another. We all, I think, have very deep concerns about both the current environment and the situation going forward, given how challenging it is going to be to conduct a military operation in a place like Gaza.
Is it your understanding at this point that Israel has essentially secured its territory? There has been some rocket fire in southern Israel today, but what is the risk, as you understand it right now, for people in Israel?
So I'll leave it to the government of Israel to characterize exactly the security environment in their country. I don't think that's our place to do that. They do seem to have said that they have secured the areas immediately surrounding Gaza, which I know was a primary area of focus and took a number of days after these attacks began, given their complex nature, given the number of fighters involved. So I won't characterize one way or another. It does seem to have calmed considerably over the last 24 hours or so, which is fundamentally a very good thing.
Has the State Department been involved in helping Americans who want to leave Israel to leave Israel? Has that been necessary?
So our understanding is that the civilian airport in Israel remains functional, remains operating. There are commercial flights still going in and out of Israel at the moment, that some carriers have suspended those operations, which we believe is making it somewhat difficult in some cases for Americans and others to secure tickets on outbound flights. And so the State Department is going to continue working with American citizens to help make sure that they know all of the options that are available, including flights, including overland routes, and to look to provide potential new options if those become necessary.
As you go forward, are there benchmarks that you're looking for in the course of this week or next week that you're hoping can be achieved that you could then call progress?
So again, Lawrence, I think it wouldn't be for us, for the United States government, to set benchmarks for the upcoming military operation or objectives or that sort of thing. That would be for the government of Israel and the Israeli military to set for themselves. I do think they have as a very clear goal reestablishing deterrence that can prevent anything like the sorts of attacks that took place over the last several days from ever happening again, and certainly to reducing, if not ending, the capability of Hamas, the terrorist organization that conducted these attacks, from being able to do this kind of thing to the Israeli population. I think we cannot underestimate here in the United States the degree of trauma that was inflicted on the Israeli populace by these attacks. This is all still very fresh and all still very raw. And frankly, it was a day or several days that were unprecedented in the history of the country of Israel, which has obviously had a very complicated and very challenging history at times, and frankly unprecedented in the history of most countries. And so they are going to first and foremost work to prevent that sort of thing and make it clear that that sort of thing cannot happen again and will not happen again.
Deputy National Security Advisor Jon Finer, thank you very much for taking the time to join us tonight. Really appreciate it.